The debt ceiling issue has kind of thrown a wrench into this because in some ways it might have slowed down negotiations. I talked to one Democratic staffer who works for, his boss is kind of leading House Democrats on this issue and said, we're kind of acting now, as, the formal Democratic position is oppose anything but a clean debt ceiling bill, but we're also acting at the same time as if it could potentially be, tacked onto a debt ceiling package.
Welcome to Reporter's Notebook, where we talk to the Washington Examiner's top journalists about the stories breaking on their beats. I'm Jim Antle, and I'm joined today by Energy and Environment Reporter Jeremy Beaman. Jeremy, permitting has become the big issue on Capitol Hill and with the White House. Talk a little bit about the new legislation that's been introduced, and is the prospects for things that are being discussed now better than things that have been proposed before?
Sure. Well, we now have, we've had H.R. 1 pass the House. That's Republicans' sweeping energy bill, which included some permitting reform measures in there. We have Manchin's bill, which he introduced last Congress and has brought back. Biden administration and the White House endorsed that bill last Congress.
Sure.
It has again. And now we have two pieces of legislation coming out of the Republican side in the Senate from Shelley Moore Capito and John Barrasso. And this is sort of the really the beginning of, we now have proposals from both sides, and now we're sort of seeing lawmakers talk about this more publicly. I think certainly now we're at a place where I think lawmakers see it kind of a light at the end of the tunnel. There are a lot of provisions that folks on both sides support, such as shortening the time that it takes to review a large infrastructure project, and putting some constraints on litigation against such projects. But there's still some things that will have to be worked out. For example, some liberal Democrats are still very hesitant to support any legislation that would authorize more construction of fossil fuel projects, pipelines, or related infrastructure. And the White House, again, has already endorsed legislation that would do that. They've kind of considered that as a reasonable compromise, but many of their liberal allies, both in the House and in the Senate, have not yet come around on that issue. It's going to be a big sticking point. And
the Senate is really where this becomes challenging, because in the House, if you have the majority, you can pretty much do what you want. Kevin McCarthy has a majority behind what House Republicans want to do in permitting reform. The Senate, with filibuster rules and other things, and with the divisions within the Democratic caucus and that narrow majority, that's a sort of different animal.
Right, and one interesting thing about this is in the Senate, where things are tough, Democrats came out really in droves to support Manchin's bill last year. Right. They supported it overwhelmingly, which is a pretty pro-fossil fuel bill, right. On balance. And more than 4 dozen of them supported it. And only 7 Republicans supported it. And that goes to kind of some of the politics of the last Congress and the way things shaped up with the IRA,
right.
and the Inflation Reduction Act.
Right.
But again, it's going to be the big sticking point. How far does Congress really want to string the country along? That's the way some lawmakers are speaking about this issue. We have to do this for the good of the country, where we're not building things fast enough. So it's kind of going to be come down to how much pressure these lawmakers feel that they're under, I think, in order to go ahead and vote for something like that. Again, the White House has supported this. They've kind of held their nose. John Podesta most recently said the president doesn't support everything in Manchin's bill, but he supports it because he sees it as a reasonable compromise. And so any compromise is going to have to see some fossil fuel language in there most likely, and some things Republicans aren't necessarily going to want.
And I mean, this was a big part of how, at least some promises regarding permitting reform were a big part of how Inflation Reduction Act succeeded, where Build Back Better failed.
Yeah, it was basically Schumer made a two-sided promise to Manchin, or really it was a reciprocal promise. Manchin
Sure.
said, "I'll vote for this thing if you bring this permitting bill forward," and they brought it forward and it failed. But a lot of folks are, again, and we've spoken about this before, see this as the one thing, really big, substantial thing that can get pretty sweeping bipartisan support. The debt ceiling issue has kind of thrown a wrench into this because in some ways it might have slowed down negotiations. I talked to one Democratic staffer who works for, his boss is kind of leading House Democrats on this issue and said, we're kind of acting now, the formal Democratic position is oppose anything but a clean debt ceiling bill, but we're also acting at the same time as if it could potentially be, tacked onto a debt ceiling package. That kind of it's kind of two paths that they're treating it as right now. So, Senate continues to hold hearings on this, and the White House has staked out its position. So we'll see.
Talk a little bit about the Biden administration's new power plant rule. What will it do, and why are some people against it?
Well, it's a big deal, arguably the largest, sort of the biggest deal of the Biden regulations. So basically, if you remember the Clean Power Plan from the Obama days, this is a replacement to the replacement of that. The Trump administration came in, got rid of the Clean Power Plan, put its own power plant rule in place. Both that and the Obama plan were, tossed in court. Tossed out, ruled against in court rather.
Right.
And so what the rule would do is regulate new and existing fossil fuel fired power plants. This is coal, this is natural gas. And the idea is to reduce carbon emissions. It's particularly for carbon emissions. There are other regulations that, authorities the EPA has to regulate, mercury and other pollution from power plants. But this is just for greenhouse gas emissions. This is a big deal for the Biden administration's climate agenda. That's the primary greenhouse gas pollutant, and so Biden has signed the U.S. up to have basically zero carbon power by 2035. It's very ambitious, and so this would require plants to adopt certain technologies, including carbon capture to capture their emissions, to co-fire with cleaner fuels, or else to basically shut down. And so there's a lot of support for this kind of measure. It's been long awaited for the environmental community. Republicans and some industry groups, coal industry groups, sharply oppose this rule because it is expected in EPA's forecast that it will result in the shutdown of plants. And the grid is already quite strained, and demand is going to grow for power, and so that's a big concern among opponents.
And power is a really big thing in Washington.
It is.
Thank you, Jeremy. You can read Jeremy and subscribe to our Daily on Energy newsletter at washingtonexaminer.com.